So what he's saying is that, look, putting other people above you or letting them put you above them, those are both flawed. And any perspective that leads to that must also be flawed. And so what Jesus is saying in Matthew 23, I think, or what is implied there, is that both shame and pride are both destructive. And the ditch of smallness and the ditch of bigness must also be destructive, must also be flawed. And so humility ultimately will be the opposite, not of pride, but of whatever it is that creates both shame and pride.
Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
I want to welcome you back to Theology Curator. I am your host, Kurt Willems. I'm excited to finally be able to put this particular conversation out into the world. My friend Dan Kent has written a book called Confident Humility, and I really recommend this one. This has been a study that I know I'm going to be coming back to multiple times. It's full of wisdom, insight, and clarity. I really appreciate the clarity of his book and his approach. If you've ever wondered about what humility is all about, and if it's about being confident, well, yeah, you can be confident and humble at the same time. And I think that's one of the gifts this book brings to the table. Hey, I wanted to also mention that we have several other interviews in the pipeline. As I am able to cut time out of the day to edit them, I will bring them to you. The hard challenge is that both my wife and I work full-time, and we also have kids at home. So one of the things we're having to do is sort of split the workday up. And when we do that, it really leaves very little time for my social media engagement. So hopefully as we move into summer, that frees up a bit as her school year comes to a close and I have a little bit more of my workable hours in the day back. And in the meanwhile, I hope you'll hang with me as I continue to try and get these episodes to you as promptly as possible. We've got several other ones that are on the way. We've got some on the openness of God and how that plays into our understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. We've got one dealing with artificial intelligence that I'm excited about, and so many others coming. So with that, my friends, I want to invite you to enjoy this conversation with my friend Dan Kent. Dan is the co-host of a podcast with Greg Boyd, another friend of mine, and he does such a good job of asking the questions that come in from listeners and guiding those conversations with Greg and bringing his own fresh insight to the table as well. I think you're going to find that he has some great things to say in this interview as he brings insight about humility. Let's jump in. I want to welcome you back to this podcast, my friends. I am sitting with Dan Kent, who is a buddy of mine who recently put out a book called Confident Humility, Becoming Your Full Self Without Becoming Full of Yourself, which I think is one of the best subtitles of all time, Dan. That's just the honest truth.
Woo-hoo!
Dude,
all right, thank you.
Nailed it. Now, let's be honest. Did you come up with that? Did the publisher tell you that was your subtitle? I mean, come on. That's really good.
Well, thank you. It was actually a line out of the book that I just really liked, and so I just pulled it from what I wrote. So,
dude,
yeah,
so good. That's solid, man.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
well, and there's a lot of pressure. And if you have a book coming out, which you had mentioned, there's a lot of pressure to get the tagline right.
Oh, dude, yeah, no, absolutely. I'm in that phase where the proposal was accepted, and we're about to get the contract, and I'm thinking to myself, since I sent it in to them and accepted, I'm kind of like, I don't like the title that much. Subtitle's okay, but I'm hoping I'm sure there'll be some flexibility, but dude,
Always.
when you nail it, it's just obvious. You know what I mean? Like,
well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So great stuff. And I mean, even in that idea, I mean, at the front cover, it says, "In the spirit of Dallas Willard," quote by Greg Boyd. I mean, what a double dose of awesome.
I know, it's such an honor. And Kurt, on the back too. I mean, one of the greatest honors of my life is having kind of my three theological heroes all endorse my book.
Yeah.
You got Paul Eddy, Greg Boyd, and Bruxy Cavey. I mean, it was just this absolute blessing, and it just one of my favorite things in my entire life was having them endorse the book. And total honor,
dude. Yeah, no, that's amazing. And you and I were talking offline here a little bit about how surreal the world of the internet makes these kinds of situations where you and I can talk, and in what universe would we have even known about each other without the internet, let alone your connection to Bruxy probably was born somehow out of the internet, because how do Greg and Bruxy become friends without knowing each other doing things? I mean, it's just crazy.
Right.
Like, so what a cool thing to really get to step into that. And man, I've we've known each other for a while now, and I've just really been impressed. Where I get to hear your voice most often is the podcast you host for or with Greg Boyd, Apologies and Explanations. Is that what you call it?
That's right.
Yeah,
Greg Boyd, Apologies and Explanations. Yeah. That's been for me. That was sort of like a real blessing as well, because it's like, I used to listen to these podcasts where I think it was James Altucher. He had like an Ask Altucher podcast or something, and he's not a religious person, and but he would just do these little 5-minute podcasts where he would answer a question every time. And the first thing I thought was, Greg Boyd is perfect for this, and I was stunned that he wasn't doing it. And so I was thrilled when he said, "Yeah, I'll do that." And so it's been really fun. This is going on our 4th year. This spring will be our 4th year. We'll start. And that's been just a blast. And Greg, Greg, you give him a little nudge, and the profundity machine just starts cranking out profundity. And so that podcast is just a blast. So
yeah, man. And I think one of your gifts is just asking good questions. I mean, I think you take questions from the audience, but you're really good at kind of making them clear and succinct. Because I know when I've done audience questions and that kind of stuff in the past, that sometimes they're really long, right? They're like 2 paragraphs, and it's like, I'm feeling all of these things, and my question is something about these things, and you have to kind of synthesize and bring the essence out. Yeah.
Kurt, I feel seen. I feel known.
Oh, man.
Some of the questions, sometimes I'll get these 3 or 4 page testimonies, and I think there's a question in there somewhere. And, people put so much work into it that I want to honor that, but at the same time, boy, that creates a lot of work. And so thank you for that. I feel so validated and known.
Oh my gosh, man. No, I kind of I gathered that just based on the format. It has to be something of that nature. And so folks who are listening to me probably know about this podcast, but in case you don't, go check it out. What I also love is the format is like 3 to 10 minutes typically. I mean, it's in that zone. And yeah, I mean, you do interviews and other special episodes, but like the main chunk of the show is just quick little nuggets from Greg's brain. Very impromptu most of the time is my understanding as well, which makes it fun. And, I don't know if I've missed, I mean, I may miss episodes here or there, but it's on accident. I just, if I open my own podcast app, and I'm not listening to myself and critiquing myself and saying, Kurt, you could be better, you piece of, I'm listening to you guys, a lot of the time. So,
well, that's, I appreciate that. And Greg is worth the time. He really is. So, and hey, listen, you are worth the time too. And I'm a little behind on your podcast, but it's definitely on the top of my list. So it's really, you have good content, and I feel I consider it an honor to be on your show, because you really know the right things to talk about, and you're really good at distilling really complicated and deep stuff into something that's manageable and understandable. And I told you this before. It's like I have N.T. Wright's books, and I have Jimmy Dunn's book, and I just they're so big, Kurt, and I can't.
Yes.
I just haven't been able to carve out a month to just throw myself into it. And so I think I love the work that you're doing, and I'm glad to be on the show.
Hey man, appreciate that a lot. And you've been so encouraging over the years. So I definitely appreciate that. And dude, we're talking about confident humility. So let's step into that a little bit. I mean, this is really cool because for me, there's so many different images that I inherited for humility. Like, know who you're not. Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Or, you kind of know your strengths, but don't something or other. It's about like, you're going to talk about the ditch of bigness and smallness, and we'll talk about some of that. But it gets into those sort of like polarities of you're either awesome but aren't cocky, or you're not awesome, know someone who is awesome, who makes you feel awesome even though you suck, right? Like, it seems like it's a little messier than that. But maybe tell us a little bit before we go too far into the content. Tell us a little bit about the journey getting up to saying, I want to talk about this, I want to write about this. What led you to this topic in particular?
Yeah, I think for me, and I talk a little bit about this. I mean, there's very little in the book about me, but I do kind of frame it in the beginning about how, when I was saved, I kind of grew up with a very young mom. She was 14 when she had me. And she worked hard and she wasn't around as much as she would have liked to have been. And so I really raised myself, and I took that seriously, and I was looking for role models, and I was always looking for father figures, and so when I was at church, I really liked this idea of discipleship and making Christ my Lord and my teacher, and so church really connected with me, and I sort of, when I was 15, 16, 17 years old, I really kind of got into the faith, but the problem was that my church that I was at, they had a very low view of human nature, and they kind of viewed people as fundamentally bad and without any ounce of inherent goodness, just like totally bad. And anything good that we do, anything good about us is only because the Holy Spirit is supernaturally intervening in some way.
Yeah.
But on our own, there's no goodness in us. And so people would say in prayer, Lord, I am just a despicable sinner and hopelessly dependent and all that kind of stuff. And that sounds very religious, but I had such a hard time with that because I didn't think that Jesus could attract the crowds that he attracted with that message.
Fascinating.
And as a kid, and this is very simplistic, but this is where I was at the time. Looking at children's books and the posters on the walls at the church. I mean, Jesus was happy. All the children around him were happy. Everybody was happy around him. None of them looked like they thought of themselves as despicable or fundamentally wicked in that way. And so I didn't really. I thought that there was something off about that very negative view of human nature and this idea that we are fundamentally totally bad. And at the same time, this is in the early 90s. And at school, I was getting the exact opposite message. This is during the self-esteem movement when it was at its peak. And there, everybody was saying, you're fundamentally good, and you are wonderful, and you're awesome just the way that you are. And boy, that didn't seem like it made much sense either, because it's like, how do you know if I'm awesome? You don't even know me, And it just seems so empty and unjustified. And so I really felt like this conflict between these two views. And as a kid trying to find a path in life, that was really frustrating because there was so much hanging on how I viewed myself. Am I fundamentally bad or am I fundamentally good? And the whole orientation of life differs if you go down one of those paths. And when I was in college, I stumbled upon Matthew 23 and Jesus' teaching on humility. And it really was like a strike of lightning, like, oh my gosh, Jesus is basically overthrowing both of these perspectives. And as I dug into that more, I realized that Jesus offers this third way that is pretty radical, because these two perspectives that I'm fundamentally bad or fundamentally good, they both lead to very destructive things. When you believe that you're fundamentally bad, that inevitably leads to shame. And when you believe that you're fundamentally good, that inevitably leads to arrogance. And Jesus overthrows the whole thing, which I think is psychologically profound, because it helps us escape the shame and the arrogance that comes with these two more common perspectives. And so I felt like I have to write about this because I just thought it was that profound.
Wow. And it's always interesting to me when the Bible and its teachings line up with things we learn about the human psyche or the universe, right? And of course, it doesn't always work out that way, right? The world wasn't made in 7 literal days. We know this from science, but there's those cool, like, ethical moments in Jesus that actually work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's crazy. And I think this is one very clear example that we're catching up to Jesus with science and with just ethical understandings of the universe and all of that. And so, you talk about good versus bad, self-image, and how we really step into the conversation on humility. And the metaphor you use is this ditch of smallness and ditch of bigness. And you've already kind of gotten to the point that, in Matthew 23, Jesus says both of those have deficits. Can you unpack those ditches a little more and maybe just take us towards Matthew 23, and then I can follow up with some other comments in that zone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the fundamental difference between the two perspectives, between the ditch of smallness and the ditch of bigness, is this idea that in the ditch of smallness, I am fundamentally bad, and in the ditch of bigness, I am fundamentally good, and that's just what I inherently am. And it's interesting because if you ask anybody in either of those perspectives, what do you think about humility? Both of them will say, oh, humility is very, very important. But the problem is that their understanding of humility emerges out of their ditch. And so it comes with the philosophical presuppositions of their ditch. And so what you'll find, especially in Christian circles, is that people understand humility most often in the ditch of smallness as being the opposite of pride. Humility is the opposite of pride. And what happens then is that if humility was the opposite of pride, and if pride is like any type of positive feeling about the self, then that creates this profound downward pressure. Like, in order for me to be more humble, I have to be more and more small in my view of myself. And it kind of creates like this race to the bottom. And so what Jesus does is he says the basis of both of these perspectives is wrong. You are neither fundamentally good nor fundamentally bad. Ultimately, and he doesn't say this in Matthew 23, this is pulled from other parts of the text. Ultimately, fundamentally what we are is we're fundamentally loved.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. That's the philosophical difference, is that we're neither fundamentally good nor fundamentally bad. We're fundamentally loved. And goodness and badness is like this opportunity that God puts in our lap. We each have a certain range of potential for being good or bad. And this is why the Old Testament says things like, I have placed before you fire or water, life or death, blessings and curses. Choose life. And that's sort of like the what we have. That's in our say so. But fundamentally, we're loved. And so what you see in Matthew 23 is, he agrees with the ditch of smallness that pride is bad. He says, the Pharisees, they basically gloat about themselves and they love the place of honor at the tables. But you are not to be like that. You are not to let anybody call you teacher. You are not to let anybody put you above them. The ditch of smallness is right. Pride is bad. But then he overturns this whole thing. He turns it on its head. He says, nor are you to view yourself as less than others. That is, don't call anybody on earth father. Don't call anybody on earth teacher. And that is, don't exalt other people above you either. And it's not the label teacher or father that bothers him, because he uses it right in this passage. He refers to the Pharisees as the teachers of the law. So what he's saying is that, look, putting other people above you or letting them put you above them, those are both flawed. And any perspective that leads to that must also be flawed. And so what Jesus is saying in Matthew 23, I think, or what is implied there, is that both shame and pride are both destructive, and the ditch of smallness and the ditch of bigness must also be destructive, must also be flawed. And so humility ultimately will be the opposite, not of pride, but of whatever it is that creates both shame and pride. And I talk more about that in I think chapter 4 of the book, of what that thing is.
Yeah.
But the way that James Kellenberger kind of really has a great analogy of what I was trying to get at, and he says that if you think of like pacifism and war, you could say that pacifism is the opposite of winning a war, but you could also say that pacifism is the opposite of losing a war. But you wouldn't say that pacifism is a balance between winning a war and losing a war. Pacifism is like this totally other thing that has nothing to do with war itself. It's against war itself. And in the same way, humility, yeah, it's the opposite of pride, but it's also the opposite of shame. In fact, it's the opposite of whatever it is that creates both shame and pride. And I just think that changes so much in our discipleship and in our spiritual walk.
Oh man. Yeah. And there's a lot to distill there. I mean, wow. And you're getting at a few things that I'm excited about. We don't have to go down these rabbit trails too much, but one of the things that I'm really excited about with New Testament studies is just noticing the theme of shame and honor. And because we don't think in those categories as Western people, like we don't start there. At least we can get there. And I think a lot of good work has kind of helped us to start thinking about shame in a more culturally contextual way. But you go to Eastern countries and everything is honor and shame. And it seems to me that humility is actually one of the characteristics of honor in the New Testament, and another opposite to shame. And so it's just fascinating as you talk about these opposites. And I'm curious, when you're thinking about these third way types of things, and you're thinking of humility, how does the word confident really play in? You've really touched on that already to a point, but the title is not just provocative; it's intentional. Confident humility. So how can you be humble like Jesus and confident like Jesus in the same breath?
Yeah, I think I would go a step further and say I think that real confidence requires the humility that Jesus teaches.
Beautiful.
And I believe that anything else is just not confidence; it's something else. And the reason why I think that is because I think when you get to the point where you realize that we are neither fundamentally good nor fundamentally bad, but we are fundamentally loved, what that means is that I am inherently secure. I'm secure, and like I don't have to prove myself. I don't have to earn anything. I'm already fundamentally loved. God loved us while we were still sinners. So when we were at our absolute worst, God loved us with this profound love. And so security is basically the foundation that all mental health strives for. And in Christ, we have that as a default. Confidence, a lot of times, emerges out of dysfunction, where people want to be confident, and they confuse it with security. And so what they'll do is they'll try to perform to get this security. And so there's a lot of pressure on performance. And so, for instance, like if I believe that I have, let me put it this way. The foundation of shame and pride is this idea of inequality. If I feel shame, I feel inferior to others.
Yeah.
If I feel proud, I feel superior to others. Well, that assumes a hierarchy. That assumes that there really is this difference out there where some people are above others and some people are below others. And that is the foundation that Jesus totally disrupts and says, no, you are all brothers and sisters. You are all loved equally. And so this idea that some people are better than others is a delusion. And what happens is that when we live in that delusion, as soon as I think that some people are better than others, I can't help but become self-obsessed, because I want to know, where do I stand in the hierarchy? And how do I move up in the hierarchy? Well, one way that I move up is through performance. And now suddenly when I'm learning to play the violin, it's not just about learning to play the violin. It's trying to be an amazing person who plays the violin. And it becomes part of my ego, and it's part of my strategy to move up in this hierarchy that Jesus says doesn't exist. And so when we can approach anything that we do from the perspective of the security that we have in Christ, now suddenly all these things that we participate in don't have all that extra baggage that, what does this say about me? It doesn't say anything about you. All it says is, how good are you at the violin? That's all it says. And so from that, it's such a radically different approach to things, where I can go and do things just for the fun of doing it. I'm given a presentation on tree frogs, not to show everybody how smart I am, but just to share what I know about tree frogs. It's not a big deal. It's just, this is what I know about tree frogs, and now I'm telling it to you. Or if I'm doing a sermon on Romans, it's not like I'm this wonderful, brilliant, pastor. I'm just a guy who's telling you what I know about Romans or whatever. And it's just it basically turns like, is people get so stressed and so anxious about the things that they engage in. And I think part of that is because they tie their ego to it. Yeah. But the only reason why they tie their ego to it is because they think that it matters somehow. They think that it matters about themselves, how good they perform at something. And I think what Jesus teaches is that, look, you're fundamentally loved. You're not going to be loved more if you do good. It doesn't change your security in any way how you perform. Even if you go out and you do the most wonderful performance ever, it doesn't change your status in any way. And so I think what that does is it just it takes a lot of the pressure off of our performance, because really what confidence is based on is not me. It's based on what skill I have or what I'm trying to do. All it is that it's an assessment of how good I think I am at a given task. And so I can be good. I could have a robust knowledge of tree frogs, and I could be confident in my presentation on tree frogs because I've read everything there is to read about tree frogs. And so I'm confident in that, and without boosting my ego, because I know that it doesn't really mean anything. I'm loved. Even when I was at my worst, I was loved with an unsurpassable love. This isn't going to help me be loved more. And it's just me sharing what I know about tree frogs. And so I think it's pretty profound, because in the world, if you don't have that security, you have to earn it yourself. And now everything that I do has all this extra weight and all this extra agenda to it, and it sucks.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No. And now I'm going to Google tree frogs and try and find out a bunch of facts so that next time it comes up, I can say, well, tree frogs. No, I'm not going to do that, because that would be prideful, or driven by shame, my lack of knowledge. But dude, no, that totally resonates. And it kind of connects to something I wanted to ask you about. You kind of, I think you make up this word, if I remember right, estimating.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Estimating. And, I made it sound like it was about mating tree frogs. That's not the point here. But estimating, and it's, connected to this idea. And one of the things you draw out in that section is it's possible to be both prideful, but at the same time exude shame. And it's one of those kind of things that you say, well, both those are contrasts to humility. So talk to us about this word you kind of insert into our vocabulary and how it relates to some of the stuff you're talking about.
Yeah. So I think where estimating comes from is when Jesus says, don't put anybody above you and don't let anybody put you above them, for you are all brothers and sisters. What he's saying is that when you put other people above you, or when you let them put you above them, you're engaging in a delusion. No one is above anybody else. There is no hierarchy. That's a delusion. And so the more we buy into this idea that some people are better than others, the more we participate in a non-reality. And what happens with that particular delusion, and I've worked with delusional patients for 20 years, and so this is like one of my specialties, is working with delusions. But what happens is, as soon as I believe that some people are better than others, I immediately start to ask questions about where I am on the hierarchy, it's estimating my esteem. It's estimating my rank, and it can become pathological. But what happens then is shame and pride are sort of the result of that. When I tally up how good I'm doing at everything, and I realize I'm not doing very good, well, then I feel shame because I feel like I'm on the low end of the hierarchy. But when I tally up everything and I feel pretty good about what I'm doing, well, now I feel pride because I'm on the high end of the hierarchy. But what you notice there is that even though I come to different results, the math that I perform is exactly the same. The math is basically, I'm going to look at these external attributes that I think are important, and I'm going to estimate how I'm doing on each, and then add those up, and then that's how I'm going to feel about myself. It's a very outward in sort of equation that I operate under, and I take these external attributes, whether it's my how good my hair looks, how tall I am, how skinny I am, what my bowling average is, whatever I think is important. That's now suddenly going to be plastered to the inside of my psyche as my value. And what Jesus says is that that's all the result of a delusion. The fact of the matter is that you are secured from the inside out. You don't need to do these outside in equations. And the fact that it's the same equation, whether you end up in shame or pride, it's the same math that's performed, helps us explain how so many times you can get people that exhibit both shame and pride about things. And so, for instance, you'll get people who are just they beat themselves up and they feel so loathsome, but at the same time, they just totally denigrate other people and call them idiots and stuff like that. And it's like, it's this weird thing of you feel shame, obviously, but also you're very arrogant towards these people who you think are idiots. And that's because, shame and pride can coexist because it's the same math. My favorite example to talk about is, and I've seen this a lot when you look at the creation story, where Adam and Eve, they ate of the tree and then they fell. A lot of commentators will say the reason why Adam and Eve fell is because of their pride, and their pride was that they wanted to be like God. And that was very proud of them. That was very, arrogant for them to want to be like God. But the fact of the matter is you could also say it was their shame, because they clearly didn't feel good enough about themselves the way they were. And both of those narratives make total sense of what Adam and Eve did, because they're both two sides of the same coin. And so that's what I really unpack in chapter 4 on estimating. But really, all of that comes from this idea that some people are better than others. And when we can grow out of that delusion that some people are better than others, and we can grow into the reality that we are all brothers and sisters and we have this profound equality, then a lot of these delusional practices, I think, will start to dissipate.
Yeah, and my sense is that that's where really having a firm foundation on how God sees you, who God is in Jesus, what Jesus has done, because, or to even say you're worthy of this, you're worthy of cross and resurrection. You are so incredibly loved already. You talk about agape in here, and I'm curious about, maybe we can kind of wrap up at least some of this by talking about how agape and true Jesus-like humility come together for you in this book, but also in the Christian life.
Yeah, I think ultimately agape is kind of what we're made for. And agape basically being the type of love that unifies people. When Jesus prays to God that we may be one, even as the Trinity is one, in John 17, I think. That oneness is based, I think, on their love. If God is love, God is agape love. God is this self-sacrificial, other-oriented, choice-based love, and that's what binds the Trinity, I think, and that's what Jesus calls us to, is to be this community of agape loving people where we have self-sacrificial, other-oriented, choice-based love for one another. And what happens though is that in order for us to have that type of love, we have to grow out of this delusion of inequality. We have to grow out of, the society that we're born into, because we're not born into agape love. We're born into some kind of perverted community. I call it contract society, where we don't have other-oriented love for others. Everything that we do is based on what do I get out of it. And even like a lot of times, in our land where we are born into, we're born into the land of prenuptial agreements and terms and conditions and things like that, where, two people might get together and have a relationship, but it's always when the relationship is mutually beneficial. And what God is calling us into is something a lot more profound and a lot more secure than that. But we'll never get to the community that God calls us to if we're operating under the delusion of inequality, because we can't really have agape love for someone if we think that they're better than us. And we can't have agape love for someone if we think that they're worse than us. What we'll have is something else. So if somebody that we think is less than us, we'll have pity for them, but it won't really be the type of love that God has for them. It'll be something else. And so I think in order to have this agape love, which is what we're made for, I think we have to grow out of the delusion of inequality. And really, that's what humility, I think, is growing out of this delusion that some people are better than others, growing into the reality that we are all brothers and sisters, and we have this profound equality, and we have this security that's not based on anything that we do or any of our attributes. It's just there. It's based on God's act of love that He made for us, and I think that secures us in a way that the more we live into that, the more we push against hierarchy, and the more we can now grow into the type of community that we were made for. I think that's the best I can summarize it. For now. So
that's great. No, that's super. I mean, it's just such a gift to be able to really think about an issue that's central to the New Testament. I mean, you think of Paul talking about the humiliation of Jesus, even on a cross, right?
Yeah.
You think of Jesus's teachings in the Sermon on the Mount on humility, and throughout the Gospels, especially, of course, Matthew 23 being a great example of that. So humility is all over the New Testament. But if we don't have a handle on what humility is actually trying to invite us into and is actually doing, if we get stuck in a ditch, that doesn't really help us be more like Jesus. And so you're helping us become, at least potentially, more like Jesus by simply helping us be aware that pride and shame are the opposites of humility, and that confidence, however, is not necessarily an opposite when measured well. So what a gift, dude. This has been really fun for me. And I'm curious, what else is going on? Do you have anything beyond the book that you're thinking about, you're working on? How can we continue to track with your journey?
Oh, well, thanks for that. I'm working on a study guide for the book. I've been so thrilled with the feedback that I've gotten on it that I want to create a study guide so people can use it in their small groups. So I'm hoping to have that out here this spring. And then I have a series that I've been working on for a couple years called The Training of KX12. And basically it's a modern version of the Screwtape Letters, and it deals with a lot of contemporary issues. And so it's a collection of letters from a demon in hell written to a demon on earth, and they're trying to corrupt this kid, basically. And I'll eventually follow this kid up to old age. But so far he's in junior high, and I have 2 volumes out. Volume 3 should be out in 2020. So that's been real fun. And those are the primary things I'm working on. And, the podcast with Greg is such a blessing, and I have such a good time with that as well. So.
Yeah. And you're teaching pastor at Woodland Hills now, teaching about 10, 12 times a year on the big stage. Plus you have an active recovery ministry you help lead and shepherd. Yeah. Is it called The Refuge?
The Refuge, that's a total blessing. And being with Greg at Woodland Hills is a total honor, and we have such a big community that if you would have told me 20 years ago that I would be giving sermons, first of all, I would have thought you were crazy. But being able to give a sermon to that crowd is it's such an honor, and I consider it very sacred, and it's a blast. And The Refuge, boy, that's like every pastor's dream, I think, because it's the type of place where we have recovery groups, we've got sexual addiction groups, we've got grief groups, we've got spiritual growth groups. But even though we have all these different things, we share a meal together, and then we have music together and a short message, and then people go off to their groups. And I tell you what, man, we have people from the shelter there. We have people from the street who will come in with their shopping carts, and they'll get some bread and stuff, and they'll we have CFOs from companies there, and just this wide range of socioeconomic diversity, and we all sing together, and it's just the most beautiful thing, and it's so real, and it's a real honor. So yeah, it's cool.
Wow, man. Well, hey, I am thrilled for the on-the-ground ministry you're doing, the online stuff, the writing. Man, this is just such a gift to the body of Christ, and I'm just encouraged and hope you'll keep at it, as I know you will. And, of course, they can find you at renew.org and renew with a K, REKNEW.org. You're actually the editor there now, right? Editor-in-chief, basically. That's over right. There. And kind of running that game as well as a podcast. So friends, track down Dan, track down what he's up to, find him on Twitter. He says funny things. I mean, it's just good times. So Dan, this has been such a pleasure. And I just really look forward to more conversation, of course, offline, but who knows, maybe we have another conversation about demons or something sometime. That sounds pretty rad. So
sounds good.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thank you, Kurt.
Hey, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.